Something was wrong with the humans and I could not look away. I had been standing on the observation gallery above Training Hall 9 for less than 3 minutes, and already the laughter among my unit had died. Not slowly, not gradually. It just stopped, the way sound stops when a decompression alarm triggers, and every throat in the room closes at once. My name is Vorath Kess. I am the commanding officer of Strike Unit Apex, the Galactic Coalition's most decorated combined species tactical team. 12 warriors from 12 apex predator species, handpicked from billions, tested in 63 engagements across 4 contested sectors. We are the blade the Coalition reaches for when diplomacy fails and standard military force is not enough. I have personally ended more hostile combatants than most species lose in a regional conflict. I am not someone who frightens easily, but I am someone who recognizes danger when it walks into a room, and something dangerous had just walked into Training Hall 9. There were 20 of them, humans, the newest addition to the Coalition, granted provisional membership barely 8 months after first contact. Command had attached their unit to our upcoming campaign against the Hollow Swarm, an extragalactic hive organism that had consumed 3 frontier colonies in the past year. When I received the orders, I assumed it was a political gesture, a way to make the humans feel included, while real warriors handled the actual fighting. My unit agreed. Threll, my second in command, and a Gorvon who stood nearly 3 meters tall, with bone-plated arms that could crush starship hull plating, had called them soft meat when he read the briefing. Everyone laughed. Even Yisha, the Fenari sniper who never laughed at anything, made a sound that might have been amusement. We came to the observation gallery expecting entertainment, a chance to see what these small, fragile, unaugmented creatures thought combat preparation looked like. I brought my bioscanner. Threll brought his sense of superiority. Dorvon, the Kreth Blademaster whose 4 arms each carried a weapon sharper than anything the humans likely possessed, brought open contempt. The humans filed into the hall below us, wearing simple clothing, no armor, no exoskeletal rigs, no cybernetic reinforcement of any kind. Their bodies were exposed, and those bodies looked disturbingly vulnerable. Thin skin, no natural plating, no venom sacs or retractable claws. Their skeletal structure, visible on my scanner, showed calcium-based bones that any member of my unit could snap with moderate effort. Threll leaned toward me and whispered that he had seen sturdier construction in furniture. Their leader entered last. The briefing file identified her as Sergeant Major Danielle Corrado. She was small even by human standards. Her skin showed dozens of old scars, pale lines that crossed her arms and neck like a map of violence. Her hair was cut short, and her eyes moved constantly, cataloging the room, the exits, the structural supports, and the observation gallery above. When her gaze reached us, she paused. She looked directly at me through the reinforced glass, not with fear, not with the deference that most junior species showed when they realized they were being evaluated by Strike Unit Apex. She looked at me the way I had seen veteran predators study their environment before a hunt. Then she smiled. It was small and brief, and it carried absolutely no warmth. It was the smile of a creature that knows something you do not, and is content to wait while you figure it out. She turned away from me and faced her unit. She said one word. I did not hear it through the glass, but the effect was instantaneous. Every human in the hall began to run. Not jog, not trot. They launched into a full sprint around the perimeter of the training hall, and the pace they set was aggressive. My scanner registered their cardiovascular output climbing rapidly. Heart rates elevated. Oxygen consumption spiked. Muscles engaged across their entire lower body in a pattern of coordinated exertion that was mechanically efficient, but biologically expensive. They were burning energy at a rate that my scanner flagged as unsustainable. Except they sustained it. 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. The sprint did not slow. Their breathing became audible through the gallery's audio feed, a harsh rhythmic sound that filled the observation deck. Sweat appeared on their skin in quantities that seemed medically alarming. My scanner showed their core temperatures rising steadily, and I expected them to stop, because every species I had ever studied had thermal limits that triggered automatic shutdown when the body risked overheating. The humans did not stop. Their bodies were overheating, and they ran through it. My scanner showed a cooling mechanism I had never encountered. They were using the sweat itself as an evaporative heat exchange system. Their bodies were leaking fluid through their skin, allowing it to evaporate, and pulling heat away from their core in a continuous cycle that let them keep running while their muscles screamed for rest. 20 minutes, 25. I kept waiting for one of them to fall. In training exercises with other coalition species, there was always a moment when the body simply stopped cooperating. The Gorvon hit a wall of lactic acid at the 14-minute mark. The Fenari overheated after 11. Even the Kreth, who could sustain combat intensity longer than most, reached involuntary shutdown within 20 minutes of sustained output. The humans blew past every threshold I knew and kept going. The pace finally slowed, but only slightly. They transitioned into a jog, then into a series of movement patterns my scanner could not categorize. Lateral shuffles, explosive short bursts, backward sprints, changes of direction so abrupt that their joints absorbed forces that should have torn connective tissue. Their ankles and knees flexed at angles that made Dorvon wince, and he had 4 joints per limb. I looked at my unit. Nobody was laughing. Threll's arms were crossed and his bone plates had shifted slightly upward, which was the Gorvon equivalent of raised hackles. Isha had produced a small optical device and was studying the humans with the focused intensity she normally reserved for long-range targets. Even Caldris, the Aelith demolitions expert whose species communicated partly through bioluminescent skin patterns, had gone a shade of pale blue that I knew meant unease. Corrado called another command. The humans stopped running and immediately dropped to the floor. They began a sequence of bodyweight exercises that I recognized from no tactical manual I had ever studied. They pressed their bodies upward from the ground, using only their arms. They pulled themselves up on overhead bars until their chins cleared the metal. They jumped from prone positions to standing with explosive force, and then dropped back down again, repeating the cycle with a speed that made my threat assessment instincts flare. This was not combat training. I had watched dozens of species train. Combat training involved technique drills, weapons familiarization, scenario rehearsal. What I was watching was something different. These humans were deliberately destroying themselves. Their muscles were failing and rebuilding under load. Their cardiovascular systems were being pushed past redline and held there. They were treating their own bodies like equipment that needed to be stress-tested to the point of breakdown. And this, I realized with a cold sensation spreading through my thorax, was still the warm-up. Corrado walked among them as they worked, occasionally correcting form or offering what appeared to be encouragement, though her tone carried the sharp edge of a commander who viewed weakness as a problem to be solved, rather than a condition to be accepted. One of the humans, a tall male with dark skin and broad shoulders, stumbled during a jumping exercise and went down hard on one knee. He was up again in less than 2 seconds, bleeding from a shallow cut on his leg, and he resumed the exercise without breaking rhythm. No one helped him. No one checked on him. The blood ran down his shin and pooled in his boot, and he kept moving. Not because anyone ordered him to, because stopping apparently was not something that occurred to him as an option. I turned to Threll. My second in command was staring at the human with the bleeding leg, and his jaw had tightened in a way I had only seen before combat. He met my eyes and said nothing. He did not need to. The bone plates along his forearms were fully raised now, and I knew what that meant. His body had identified something in the room below as a threat, and for the first time in 6 years of serving together, I saw genuine uncertainty on his face. Corrado checked a device on her wrist, and then shouted something to her unit. The warm-up was over. The humans moved to a section of the hall where training weapons had been laid out, and I watched them pick up blunted blades, padded striking implements, and protective gear that covered their heads and hands, but left the rest of their bodies exposed. They were about to begin combat drills, and I suddenly understood that the running, the exercises, the 25 minutes of cardiovascular punishment that had silenced my entire unit was not the point. It was preparation. They had deliberately exhausted themselves before training to fight, and the only reason to do that was if they expected to fight while exhausted. I gripped the railing of the observation gallery and leaned forward. Below me, Danielle Corrado cracked her neck, pulled on a pair of thin gloves, and stepped onto the sparring mat. She pointed at the largest human in the unit, a man who outweighed her by at least 40 kilos, and gestured him forward. Nobody on the gallery spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and, from below, the sharp crack of the first strike landing. I did not know it yet, but I was about to watch something that would change every assumption I had ever held about what a warrior could be. The large human came at Corrado with a straight right hand that carried his full weight behind it. She moved sideways, not backward, and the difference mattered. Moving backward was retreat. Moving sideways was positioning. She slipped the punch by centimeters, hooked her left hand behind his elbow, and used his own momentum to rotate his body past her. Before he could recover his balance, she drove her knee into his thigh, collapsed his leg, and followed him to the ground where she locked her arms around his neck, in a hold that my scanner showed was restricting blood flow to his brain. He tapped the mat twice. She released him instantly. He stood up, rolled his neck, and they reset. The entire exchange had lasted 4 seconds. Threll exhaled slowly beside me. Among the Gorvon, hand-to-hand combat was built on overwhelming force. A Gorvon fought by being bigger, stronger, and more heavily armored than whatever stood in front of them. They met resistance with greater resistance until something broke. It was effective. It had been effective for millennia. What Corrado had just done was something entirely different. She had used her opponent's strength against him. She had treated his size as a vulnerability, not an advantage. She had turned physics into a weapon that required no muscle at all. She weighed perhaps 60 kilos, and she had put a man nearly twice her mass on the ground, without ever matching his force. She redirected it. She borrowed it. She let his own body do the work of defeating itself. The sparring continued. Corrado faced 3 more opponents in sequence, and each exchange was different. She never used the same technique twice. Against a shorter, faster male, she kept distance and used precise kicks to his legs until his mobility degraded, then closed in for a choke. Against a female with exceptional reflexes, she feinted 3 times to create a pattern, then broke the pattern with an elbow strike that opened a cut above her opponent's eye. Against a heavily muscled man who tried to grapple her, she dropped her weight, slid between his legs, and attacked his knee from behind, folding him like a damaged support strut. Dorvan, the Kreth Blademaster, was gripping all 4 of his weapons. His species were the galaxy's finest close combat fighters, or so we had always believed. They trained from childhood in elegant blade forms that were as much art as warfare. What the humans were doing was not art, it was engineering. Every technique was designed around a single principle: destroy the opponent's ability to continue fighting. Joints were targeted for hyperextension. Throats were struck to disrupt breathing. Eyes were threatened to trigger flinch responses that created openings for more damaging attacks. There was no ritual, no ceremony, no honor code governing which targets were acceptable. Everything was acceptable. Everything was a target. I pulled up Corrado's service file on my datapad while the sparring continued below. What I read made the cold sensation in my thorax worse. She had been a soldier for 22 Earth years. She had served in conflicts on her homeworld before humanity ever reached space. She had been injured 11 times, including twice in ways that should have ended her career. She had returned to active duty after each injury. Not because her species had superior medical technology. Their medicine was crude compared to most coalition members. She returned because she chose to return, and because her species had developed a concept they called rehabilitation, which essentially meant they took broken bodies and forced them to become functional again through months of controlled pain and repetitive effort. They did not replace damaged parts. They repaired them, with patience and suffering, and an apparently inexhaustible tolerance for the slow, grinding work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. The sparring rounds ended, and the humans moved to free fighting. This was different. No controlled exchanges, no resets. They paired off and fought continuously, rotating partners every few minutes, and the intensity increased until the sounds reaching the observation gallery were visceral. The crack of fists against body armor, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the mat, grunts and sharp exhalations, and the occasional shout that was not pain but something else, something that sounded almost like excitement. They were enjoying it. Not in the way that psychopaths enjoyed violence. I had encountered true sadists in my career, and they had a particular energy that was unmistakable. This was different. The humans enjoyed the struggle itself, the testing, the pushing. They enjoyed finding their limits and then pressing past them, the way a climber might enjoy the burn in their muscles on a difficult ascent. The fighting was not the goal. The transcendence of their own limitations was the goal. The fighting was just the method. A human male took an elbow to the face and his nose broke. I heard the wet snap through the audio feed. He staggered back 2 steps, raised both hands to his face, gripped his own nose, and wrenched it back into alignment with a sound that made Caldris turn a shade of white I had never seen from an Aelith. Blood poured down the human's chin and chest. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, spit red onto the mat, and stepped forward to re-engage. He did not pause. He did not request medical attention. He did not even seem particularly bothered. His nose was broken and bleeding, and he treated it as an inconvenience, the same way I might treat a torn glove or a malfunctioning scanner. He went back to fighting, and within 30 seconds his movement was sharper, his reactions faster, as if the injury had woken something up in him rather than slowing him down. I checked my bioscanner. The readings were becoming difficult to process. Every human on the mat below was generating stress hormones, at levels my scanner categorized as indicative of severe trauma. Their cortisol levels were elevated beyond what most species could tolerate without psychological breakdown. Their adrenaline production was constant and sustained, not the sharp spike and crash pattern that other species exhibited, but a steady, controlled burn that kept them at peak alertness, without triggering the panic response that normally accompanied those chemical levels. They had learned to metabolize their own fear. They were using it as fuel. Yisha had lowered her optical device and was sitting very still. She was a Fenari, a species of ambush predators that hunted by analyzing their prey's weaknesses and exploiting them with a single precise strike. She was the finest sniper in the coalition. She had never missed a shot in combat, and she was staring at the humans below with an expression I had seen on her face only once before, during a firefight on Verath Station, when we were pinned down and outnumbered, and she realized for the first time that she might not survive. She was afraid. I wanted to tell her that her fear was irrational. These were allies. These humans were on our side. But I could not bring myself to say it, because I was watching them hurt each other with controlled, purposeful precision, and I understood that the control was the terrifying part. They were not berserkers. They were not mindless killers riding a wave of rage. They were calm. They were methodical. They broke each other's noses and split each other's skin and kept fighting with the disciplined focus of craftsmen refining their technique. A berserker could be waited out. Their fury would burn and fade and leave them empty. These humans did not burn. They endured. And the difference between burning and enduring was the difference between a fire that consumed itself and one that someone kept feeding. Corrado called a halt. The humans stopped fighting instantly, which was itself disturbing. The ability to transition from full-intensity combat to complete stillness in a single heartbeat spoke to a level of psychological discipline that most species achieved only through genetic modification or neural implants. The humans achieved it through practice, through repetition, through doing it so many thousands of times that the switch between violence and calm became as natural as breathing. They gathered in a circle on the mat, bleeding and sweating and breathing hard. One of them told a joke. I could not hear it clearly, but the laughter that followed was loud and genuine, and it echoed up to the observation gallery where 12 of the galaxy's deadliest warriors sat in absolute silence. I leaned over to Threll. I asked him what he was thinking. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he had fought a Skaven berserker on Korath Prime, a creature that was 200 kilos of muscle and rage, and modified pain receptors that made it nearly impossible to incapacitate. He said it was the hardest fight of his life. He said he won because the berserker eventually ran out of fury and collapsed. Then he pointed at the humans below, at the man with the broken nose who was laughing at the joke, while blood dried on his chin, and he said he did not think these creatures ran out of anything. The training knives came out next, blunted blades with sensors that registered contact points and pressure. The humans paired off again, and this time they moved differently, slower, more deliberate. Every step was calculated, every angle measured. They circled each other with the patience of predators who understood that a blade fight was decided in the first half-second of contact, and everything before that was information gathering. My hand moved to my sidearm. Not consciously. Not because I felt threatened. My body moved on its own, responding to something my conscious mind had not yet processed but my instincts had recognized immediately. The humans below me were dangerous. Not hypothetically. Not theoretically. They were dangerous in the way a loaded weapon was dangerous, in the way a reactor breach was dangerous. They were contained right now, controlled, directed. But the potential energy in that room was enough to make the predator buried deep in my Dralith hindbrain sit up and pay attention. I watched Corrado take a training knife and flow through a series of movements so fast that my eyes could not track every transition. She cut air where throats would be. She stabbed at angles that would slide between ribs. She moved the blade from hand to hand without looking at it, as if it were an extension of her nervous system rather than a tool held in her fingers. The blade rotated in her palm, reversed grip, forward grip, reversed again, each transition seamless, and each position immediately combat-ready. She could have been lethal from any angle, at any moment of the demonstration. And when she sparred with the knife, she fought from positions that would have been considered suicidal by any other species. She closed distance against longer-armed opponents. She accepted cuts to deliver deeper ones. She traded injury for position with the cold arithmetic of someone who had calculated exactly how much damage she could absorb and still remain lethal. Where Dorvan fought with blades like a dancer, precise and beautiful and at arm's length, Corrado fought with a blade like a surgeon, close and intimate and utterly without hesitation. I realized I was gripping my sidearm hard enough that my knuckles had changed color. I released it and placed both hands on the railing and forced myself to breathe evenly. Below me, the humans trained with knives for another 30 minutes. By the end, most of them were marked with sensor hits that would have represented fatal or crippling wounds in real combat. They cataloged each hit, discussed what went wrong, adjusted their technique, and did it again. They treated simulated death as data. They treated failure as curriculum. They did not fear it. They studied it. When the knife training ended, Corrado looked up at the observation gallery one more time. She found me through the glass, and this time she did not smile. She held my gaze for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds I saw something I had not expected. Not challenge, not arrogance, patience. She was waiting for us to understand, and she was willing to wait as long as it took. I turned to face my unit, 12 warriors, 12 apex predators, the deadliest collection of fighters the Coalition had ever assembled. Not one of them was looking at me. They were all still staring at the training hall below, and the silence on the gallery was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The schedule on my datapad showed 3 more training phases remaining. The next one was labeled Environmental Stress Conditioning. I did not know what that meant yet. Within the hour, I would wish I had never learned. The hall's climate control system activated with a deep mechanical hum, and the temperature inside Training Hall 9 dropped 20 degrees in under a minute. Frost crystallized on the metal floor. The human's breath became visible, rising in white clouds that caught the overhead lighting. They were still wearing their thin training clothes. No cold weather gear. No thermal layers. Nothing between their bare skin and the rapidly freezing air, except whatever their biology could provide. My scanner showed their surface temperature plummeting. Skin receptors were firing at rates consistent with severe discomfort. Blood vessels near the surface contracted, pulling warm blood inward to protect their organs. Their muscles began producing microtremors, generating heat through involuntary contraction. It was a desperate survival mechanism, the body's last resort attempt to maintain core temperature in conditions that threatened shutdown. The humans kept training. They ran drills. They executed formation exercises. They practiced hand signals and tactical communication while their fingers stiffened and their lips turned colors that my scanner flagged as medically concerning. One human's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip his training weapon. He adjusted his grip, compensated for the tremor, and kept going. After 20 minutes in the cold, the climate system reversed. Heat poured into the hall. The temperature climbed past comfortable, past warm, past hot, and kept climbing until the air itself seemed to shimmer. The frost on the floor melted and evaporated, and was replaced by the heavy stink of human sweat as their cooling system activated at maximum output. They did not stop training. The drills continued through the heat, the same precise movements executed with the same brutal efficiency, even as their bodies struggled to manage the thermal load. I watched their core temperatures on my scanner and waited for the moment when someone would collapse. In any other species, that moment would have come within minutes. The Aelith would have entered thermal shock. The Fenari would have lost motor function as their neural pathways overheated. Even the Gorvan, with their massive heat-sink bone plates, would have slowed to a crawl within 10 minutes of sustained exertion in this temperature. The humans held it off through a combination of evaporative cooling, cardiovascular regulation, and what I could only describe as pure refusal. Their skin was flushed red, their clothing was saturated, the training mats were slick with their perspiration, and they kept moving, kept drilling, kept executing formation exercises with a precision that should not have been possible from organisms under that level of thermal stress. One of them, a compact female with short blonde hair, stumbled slightly during a transition and immediately corrected without breaking formation. Nobody else acknowledged the stumble. It was irrelevant. A momentary deviation from perfection that was corrected and forgotten in the same breath. Yisha asked me how their bones did not shatter under the thermal stress. I told her I did not know. She asked how their cardiovascular systems adapted so quickly to opposing extremes. I told her I did not know that either. She went quiet, and I could see her recalculating something behind her eyes, running numbers that would change the way she assessed targets for the rest of her career. The climate system shifted again. This time it reduced the oxygen content in the air. I watched the atmospheric readout on my scanner drop from standard to thin to dangerously thin. The humans' breathing changed immediately, becoming deeper and more measured, each inhalation drawn out to extract maximum oxygen from the depleted atmosphere. Their movements slowed, but did not stop. Their cognitive function, measured by the precision of their formation drills, degraded by roughly 12%, but remained functional. They were operating on less oxygen than a Draelith needed to remain conscious, and they were still running combat drills. I had read about this in their species file. They called it acclimatization. Their bodies could adjust to hostile environments over time, physically restructuring their blood chemistry and respiratory efficiency to match conditions that would disable most species outright. Mountain populations on their homeworld lived at altitudes where the air contained barely enough oxygen to sustain base metabolic function, and they thrived there. Their ancestors had crossed frozen mountain ranges, burned through tropical forests, marched across waterless deserts, and their descendants had inherited bodies that treated hostile environments not as barriers, but as problems to solve through biological adaptation. No species in the coalition trained for environmental stress like this. We built armor and suits and climate-controlled environments because we had the technology to avoid suffering. The humans had the technology too. They chose to suffer anyway. They chose to strip away every advantage and force their bodies to adapt to the worst conditions they could simulate, because they understood something that most species never considered. Technology could fail, armor could breach, climate systems could be destroyed. When everything else was taken away, the only thing left was the body and the mind inside it, and the humans were determined to make both as resilient as physics allowed. Threll stood up from his observation seat and walked to the far end of the gallery. He stood there with his back to the glass for several minutes. When he returned, his bone plates were flat against his arms, which meant he had forced them down deliberately. He sat beside me and said nothing for a long time. Then he told me something I will remember for the rest of my life. He said that Corrado's unit had been awake for 42 hours before arriving at the compound. He said he found this in a logistics report, buried in the briefing file, that none of us had read carefully because none of us had taken the humans seriously enough to read their paperwork. 42 hours without sleep. And then they had run for 25 minutes, fought for an hour, and endured environmental extremes for another 40 minutes. On no sleep, for 2 days, on purpose. I asked him to repeat himself. He did. I asked him if the report could be wrong. He said he had cross-referenced it with the transport manifest. Their ship had departed from a training facility on their homeworld called Fort Bragg, and the flight log showed continuous activity during the entire transit. They had trained on the ship. They had trained during the approach. They had arrived at the compound and immediately entered Training Hall 9 without stopping to eat or rest. This was not an accident. This was not poor planning. This was deliberate. They had intentionally deprived themselves of sleep for 2 days and then subjected themselves to the most demanding training session I had ever witnessed, because they wanted to know exactly how they would perform under those conditions. They wanted to find their breaking point so they could learn to push it further. I looked back through the glass at the humans below. They had completed the environmental phase and moved to the next block on the schedule. My blood went cold when I read the label. Stress inoculation, live fire scenario. The training hall reconfigured. Walls rose from the floor, creating a labyrinth of corridors and rooms. The lighting dropped to tactical levels. Somewhere in the structure, automated systems activated, and I could hear the high-pitched whine of non-lethal training rounds being loaded into concealed launchers. These rounds delivered real pain on impact. They left bruises that lasted weeks. They were designed to simulate the experience of being shot without causing permanent damage, and most species used them sparingly because the psychological impact of being struck by simulated gunfire was enough to trigger lasting trauma responses. Hirado split her unit into teams of 4. The first team stacked against the entrance of the kill house, and I watched their body language shift. The joking stopped. The casual energy disappeared. What replaced it was a focused intensity that reminded me of Yusha right before she took a shot. Every muscle still, every sense engaged. Total presence in the moment. They went in. The sound of training rounds filled the gallery. Muffled impacts, shouted commands, the crash of doors being breached. I watched on the tactical display as the 4-person team moved through the structure with a fluidity that should not have been possible for a species that lacked telepathic coordination or neural networking. They cleared rooms in under 3 seconds each. They covered angles and transitioned between positions with the precision of a single organism operating through 4 separate bodies. Their communication was minimal. Short words, hand signals, sounds that conveyed meaning without forming language. Each member of the team knew exactly where the others were at every moment, not through technology, through practice. Through having done this so many times together, that they had developed an almost preternatural awareness of each other's movement patterns, timing, and instinctive choices. The lead operator would commit to a doorway, and the second operator would already be moving to cover the angle the first one could not see, without a word being spoken, without a signal being given. They anticipated each other the way a single mind anticipates its own limbs. Dorvan watched the display with all 4 of his hands perfectly still. His species trained for decades to achieve blade formations with that level of synchronization, and even their finest practitioners required verbal coordination. The humans were doing it silently, in a structure they had never seen before, against threats appearing from random positions. They had taken the concept of teamwork and forged it into something closer to telepathy. They had rehearsed this so many times that it had become instinct, not learned behavior. Instinct. The kind of deep pattern response that other species achieved through genetic programming over thousands of generations. The humans had done it in a single lifetime, through repetition so relentless that the actions had been burned into their nervous systems like scars. The scenario shifted. An ambush triggered from an unexpected direction. 2 of the automated launchers opened fire simultaneously from positions the team had already cleared, simulating an enemy that had been hiding and waiting. Training rounds struck 2 of the 4 team members. One took a hit to the ribs that doubled him over. The other caught a round on her upper arm that left it hanging at her side. For 1 heartbeat, the scenario was chaos. The carefully orchestrated room clearing had been shattered by an unexpected threat, and the team was compromised, injured, disoriented, caught in a crossfire in a confined space with no immediate exit. The heartbeat ended. The team adapted. The human with the rib hit dropped to a knee, used a wall fragment as cover, and began returning fire with his offhand. The human with the injured arm transitioned her weapon to a single-handed grip, pressed against the opposite wall, and engaged the second launcher position. The 2 uninjured members swept forward, cleared the ambush position, and called the all-clear in under 6 seconds. 6 seconds. From chaos to control in 6 seconds, with 2 injured team members, on no sleep. I felt something I had not felt in a long time. It was not fear exactly. It was the sensation a predator experiences when it realizes it has been hunting something that hunts back. A recalibration. a fundamental shift in the internal model that separated prey from threat. The humans had just crossed a line in my mind that no species in the coalition had ever approached. They ran the kill house 12 times. Each time the scenario changed. Each time new ambushes triggered from new positions. Each time the humans adapted faster. By the 6th run, they were anticipating the launchers. By the 10th run, they were neutralizing threats before the automated system could fully activate. By the 12th run, the man with the broken nose from the sparring session was leading the entry team, and he moved through the structure 3 seconds faster than any previous team. Pain made him faster. I turned that thought over in my mind and could not find a way to make it less terrifying. Pain was supposed to slow organisms down. Pain was the body's warning system, the signal that damage was occurring and the organism needed to withdraw from whatever was causing it. Every species in the coalition responded to pain by reducing activity. The humans responded to pain by increasing performance. Their bodies produced the same warning signals as everyone else. They had simply learned to override the warning and push harder. Threll was standing beside me again. He was watching the human with the broken nose clear the kill house for the 12th time, and his voice was very quiet when he spoke. He said he did not want to fight the humans. I asked him why. He was the largest and strongest warrior in the unit, and possibly in the entire coalition. A single blow from his bone-plated fist could crush a Draelith skull. He could tear through bulkhead plating with his bare hands. He was afraid of nothing I had ever seen him face. He told me it was because he watched the big human with the broken nose run the kill house 12 seconds after a medic retaped his face, and the human was faster the second time. Pain makes them faster, Commander, he said. What do you do with something pain makes faster? I did not have an answer for him. The kill house exercise ended. The humans emerged from the structure bruised and marked with training round impacts across their bodies. Several were limping. One had a welt on his neck that was already turning dark purple. They gathered in the center of the hall, and Corrado spoke to them in a low voice that the gallery audio could not quite capture. Whatever she said made them nod. A few of them smiled. Not the smile of people who were happy. The smile of people who had just proven something to themselves and found the proof satisfactory. The schedule on my datapad showed one final training phase. I looked at the label and my stomach tightened. Mental conditioning. Resistance to interrogation and captivity. I knew what those words meant. Every military in the galaxy had some version of it. The process of preparing soldiers for the possibility of being captured and subjected to coercive treatment. Most species addressed it with briefings, psychological conditioning programs, and chemical resistance packages that helped the mind resist external pressure. The humans, I was about to learn, addressed it differently. They lined up. Corrado walked down the line and selected 5 volunteers, 5 humans who stepped forward, knowing exactly what was about to happen to them and choosing to face it anyway. They were separated from the group, moved to an enclosed section of the training hall, and what happened next was partially obscured from the gallery's view by opaque screens. But the sounds came through. The audio feed carried everything, and what I heard was methodical, controlled, and deeply, fundamentally disturbing. Not because it was extreme. I had seen worse in real combat. I had witnessed interrogations conducted by species that had elevated coercion to an art form. What disturbed me was the context. These were humans doing this to other humans, to their own teammates, on purpose, as practice. They were teaching themselves to endure the unendurable. They were building resistance to psychological pressure, the same way they built resistance to cold, to heat, to low oxygen, to exhaustion. Through exposure, through repetition, through the systematic process of encountering their worst fears in a controlled environment and learning to function inside them until the fear itself became manageable. I lasted 11 minutes before I left the gallery. Not because I was squeamish, because watching volunteers submit to their own breaking point with calm, professional composure disturbed something in me that I could not name. These were not victims. They were students. They were studying the anatomy of their own psychological limits, the way a surgeon studies a body before cutting, and they were doing it with the same focused detachment. I found Yusha in the corridor outside the gallery. She was sitting on the floor with her weapon across her knees and her back against the wall. She did not look up when I approached. Her eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance, and I recognized the expression. She was recalculating every tactical assumption she had ever made, every threat assessment, every engagement model. She told me she was a sniper. She studied targets. She found weaknesses and exploited them. That was her purpose. Her entire career was built on the principle that every organism had a vulnerability that could be reached with sufficient precision. She had just spent 4 hours watching a species that systematically trained to eliminate its own vulnerabilities, and she did not know what to do with that information. I sat down beside her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The sounds from Training Hall 9 were faint through the corridor walls, but they were there, muffled, persistent, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. I told Yisha that I needed to speak with Corrado. She looked at me for the first time and asked me what I planned to say. I told her I did not know yet, but that I needed to understand something, and the only way to understand it was to ask. She nodded and went back to staring at the wall. I left her there and walked toward the human barracks level. The human barracks were smaller than I expected, utilitarian. The walls were bare metal, and the bunks were narrow and firm. There were personal items stored in uniform containers beside each bed, photographs of other humans, small objects with no apparent tactical function, books, actual physical books with paper pages, which struck me as oddly primitive for a spacefaring species. The air smelled like sweat and antiseptic, and something else I could not identify, something warm and organic, that I would later learn was the residual scent of human food being prepared in a small kitchen area at the end of the hall. Corrado met me in a common room attached to the barracks. She was sitting on a metal bench with a cup of dark liquid in her hands. Her knuckles were wrapped in cloth that showed small spots of blood from the sparring session. She had not changed out of her training clothes. She looked tired in a way that was difficult to quantify, not the dramatic exhaustion of someone at their limit, but the deep, settled fatigue of someone who had been operating beyond their limit for so long that it had become their new normal. Around her, members of her unit were eating, cleaning equipment, and tending to minor injuries with a casualness that bordered on surreal. The man with the broken nose was sitting 3 meters away, holding a cold compress to his face with one hand and disassembling a weapon with the other. He had not slowed down, he had not stopped. He had simply added medical treatment to his task list and continued working. Corrado looked up when I entered and gestured to the bench across from her. I sat down. She studied me for a moment, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed by someone whose criteria I did not understand. She asked if I had seen enough. There was no mockery in her voice, no challenge. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness of someone who did not waste time on ceremony. I told her I had seen more than enough. Then I asked her the question that had been building inside me since the first minute on the observation gallery. I asked her why her unit trained as though they were already losing. She took a drink from her cup and was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that fundamentally altered my understanding of what the humans were. She said that everything on their homeworld was bigger than them, or faster, or had more teeth. Their ancestors did not sit at the top of the food chain. They climbed there, slowly, over millions of years, by being the thing that got back up. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most heavily armed, the most persistent, the most adaptable. The thing that took a wound and learned from it. The thing that lost a fight and came back with a better strategy. She told me that human military doctrine was built on a single assumption. Everything would go wrong, the plan would fail, the equipment would break, the numbers would be against them, allies would fall, communication would collapse. And when all of that happened, when every advantage had been stripped away and every system had failed, the only thing left was the individual soldier and their ability to keep functioning. So that was what they trained. Not strength, not speed, not firepower. Endurance, adaptability, the capacity to absorb punishment that should end the fight and to keep fighting anyway. She told me about battles from her species' history, not the victories, the survivals. She described soldiers who marched through frozen mountain passes for weeks, losing fingers and toes to the cold, eating leather from their own boots when the food ran out, and arriving on the other side still ready to fight. She described a siege where defenders held a fortress for over a year, surviving on rainwater and rats, fighting off assaults with broken weapons and bare hands, and never once considering surrender. She described a retreat across a frozen river where thousands died, and the survivors kept walking because walking was the only option left. These were not legends. These were documented events. Her species had been doing this for as long as they had been writing things down. The specifics changed. The weapons evolved. The scale increased. But the core principle remained constant across every era and every conflict. When everything else fails, the human does not. I asked her about the environmental conditioning. She said humans had a word for it: acclimatization. The body's ability to restructure itself in response to hostile conditions. High altitude, extreme cold, extreme heat, low oxygen. Given enough time, the human body would modify its blood chemistry, its respiratory efficiency, its thermal regulation, to match nearly any environment. They trained in extremes not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they needed to know their adaptation threshold. They needed to know exactly how much the environment could take from them before it killed them, and then they trained to operate at 90% of that threshold until their bodies pushed the threshold further. I asked about the sleep deprivation. She smiled for the first time, and it was a tired, knowing smile that carried the weight of experience I could not imagine. She said that human history was full of battles fought by soldiers who had not slept in days, marches that lasted weeks, through terrain that would be classified as uninhabitable by coalition standards, sieges where defenders held positions for months, sleeping in shifts of minutes, eating what they could find, fighting with whatever was at hand. She said her species had learned centuries ago that sleep deprivation was not a condition to be avoided, it was a condition to be managed. You could not always choose when to fight. Sometimes the fight chose you, and it chose the worst possible moment, and the soldier who had trained to function through exhaustion would outlast the one who had not. I asked about the pain, about the broken nose and the bleeding leg, and the training rounds that left bruises like small explosions under the skin, about the way her unit absorbed damage and kept moving as if the damage were irrelevant. She set down her cup and leaned forward. She told me that pain was information, nothing more. It was the body's way of reporting damage, and it was important to listen to it, because ignoring genuine structural failure was how you turned a recoverable injury into a permanent one. But the intensity of the pain signal, she said, was not proportional to the severity of the damage. The body overreported. It sent distress signals that were 10 times louder than the actual threat, because in the evolutionary environment, false alarms were cheaper than missed warnings. A stubbed toe screamed as loud as a broken bone. A minor cut triggered the same cascade of stress hormones as a major wound. The system was designed for maximum sensitivity, not maximum accuracy. What her unit trained to do was interpret the signal accurately, distinguish between pain that meant stop and pain that meant keep going. And once they could make that distinction, pain became something they could manage, like cold or heat or fatigue. Not ignored, never ignored, managed, cataloged, filed under the appropriate urgency level, and addressed when the tactical situation permitted. I sat with that for a long time. Around us, the barracks hummed with quiet activity. Someone was laughing in the kitchen area. A card game had started in the corner. These were people who had spent the past several hours brutalizing themselves physically and psychologically, and they were playing cards and making each other laugh as if none of it had happened. Not because they were suppressing the experience, because they had processed it, filed it away, learned what they needed to learn, and moved on. I asked Corrado if she was afraid of the hollow swarm. She said yes. I waited for her to elaborate. She said fear was useful. It kept the blood moving. She meant it literally. Adrenaline, the human stress hormone, increased heart rate, sharpened reflexes, and heightened sensory acuity. Fear was not a weakness to be overcome. It was a resource to be managed, like ammunition or fuel. Too much of it paralyzed you. Too little left you slow and careless. The right amount made you lethal. I asked her what made humans different from the other species in the coalition. She thought about it for a while. Then she said something that I have repeated to myself every day since. She said most species became warriors by getting stronger, by building better armor, by developing more powerful weapons. They added things. Humans became warriors by getting harder to stop. They did not add strength. they subtracted fragility. They did not build better armor. They toughened the body underneath it. They trained to fight without weapons, without gear, without sleep, without food, without hope. Because they had learned across thousands of years of killing each other that the warrior who depended on nothing could never have anything taken from them. I stood up. I thanked her for her time. She nodded and picked up her cup again. As I turned to leave, she said one more thing. She said her unit was looking forward to working with Strike Unit Apex. She said she had studied our operational record and was impressed. She said she hoped we could learn from each other. The humility of it struck me like a physical blow. She had just spent 4 hours demonstrating capabilities that made my unit question every tactical assumption they held, and she was sitting in front of me expressing genuine respect for what we could teach her. She was not posturing. She was not performing modesty. She meant it. She wanted to learn from us the same way she had spent her entire life learning from everything that had ever tried to destroy her. I returned to the gallery level and found my unit waiting for me. They were quiet. Threll stood with his arms at his sides, bone plates flat. Yisha had moved from the corridor and was sitting in a chair by the window, her weapon still across her knees. Dorvan had sheathed all 4 of his blades, which he only did in places he considered safe. Caldris glowed a steady neutral blue. The others sat or stood in postures that ranged from contemplative to shaken. I told them the assessment was complete. I told them my report to command would recommend full tactical integration of the human unit into our operational structure. Not as support, not as auxiliaries, as equals. Threll asked me on what basis. He was not challenging me. He genuinely wanted to understand. I told him the humans were not the strongest species in the coalition. They were not the fastest. They did not have the best weapons or the most advanced technology or the most durable bodies. But they were the only species in the coalition that had mastered the art of refusing to die. They trained for failure. They prepared for disaster. They built their entire combat philosophy around the assumption that everything would go wrong, and then developed the physical and psychological tools to keep fighting after it did. I told him that in the coming fight against the Hollow Swarm, we would face an enemy that attacked in overwhelming numbers, that did not stop, that did not negotiate, that consumed everything in its path. Against that kind of enemy, the warriors who would matter most were not the ones who hit hardest in the first 5 minutes. They were the ones who were still standing after 5 hours, the ones who could take a plan falling apart and build a new one from the wreckage. The ones who would look at a situation that every tactical manual in the coalition classified as hopeless and find a way through it, not because they had better weapons or stronger bodies, but because giving up was simply not in their operational vocabulary. I told them that I had spent my career fighting beside the best warriors in the galaxy, species that could shatter stone with their fists, species that could see in the dark and strike from distances that most organisms could not even perceive. Species that had been refining the art of warfare for longer than humanity had existed. And none of those species had ever built a training program designed around the assumption that everything they relied on would fail. None of them had ever sat in a barracks after 2 days without sleep, covered in bruises and dried blood, and laughed about it over a card game. None of them had ever volunteered to be broken so they could learn what breaking felt like and figure out how to function through it. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned. They had all watched the same training session. They had all reached the same conclusion, even if they could not articulate it as clearly. The humans were something new, something the galaxy had not encountered before, not a superior warrior species, something more dangerous than that, a species that had turned the weakness of their own bodies into the foundation of a combat doctrine that no amount of natural armor or genetic enhancement could match. That night, I began writing my preliminary assessment. I stared at the screen for a long time before I started typing. The words came slowly, because the concepts behind them were difficult to express in coalition standard, a language built by species that had always been strong. The humans had built something from being weak, and there was no clean translation for what they had become. 3 weeks later, our combined force dropped through the atmosphere of Vareth Minor, and everything I had seen in Training Hall 9 became real. The colony world had been overrun by the Hollow Swarm 6 days before our arrival. Intelligence estimated a medium-density infestation, 3 hive nodes, approximately 12,000 swarm organisms spread across the colony's industrial district. Our mission was precise. Insert the forward assault element, breach the primary hive node, plant demolition charges, and extract before the swarm could mount a coordinated response. Total operation time, 45 minutes. Intelligence was wrong. Intelligence was catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. We hit the landing zone in 2 assault shuttles, Strike Unit Apex in the lead bird, Corrado's human contingent in the second. The doors opened, and the world outside was not what the briefing had described. The swarm presence was not medium density. It was overwhelming. The industrial district was a seething mass of dark bodies and razor limbs, and the wet clicking sound that swarm organisms used for echolocation. My tactical display lit up with contact markers so dense they merged into a solid wall of red. Threll was the first out the door, because he was always the first out the door. He got 4 steps before a swarm striker came over a collapsed wall and drove a barbed limb through the gap in his shoulder plating. He roared, tore the limb off the organism, and crushed its head with a single blow, but the striker was just the leading edge. Behind it came 20 more. The first 4 minutes were a nightmare. We fought from the landing zone with everything we had, and it was not enough. The Kreth Blademaster Dorvan went down when 3 strikers hit him simultaneously from different angles. His 4 arms kept fighting even as he fell, and he took 2 of them with him, but the third one opened his torso armor and he stopped moving. Caldrus dragged him to cover, while the rest of us held the perimeter. The Aelith demolition specialist caught a barbed projectile through his thigh and collapsed behind the shuttle's landing strut. I called for extraction. Command told me 40 minutes. 40 minutes in a hot zone that was getting hotter by the second. The swarm was converging on our position from every direction, drawn by the noise and the chemical signatures of fresh prey. We were pinned down, 2 warriors already out of the fight, and facing a force that outnumbered us by a factor I did not want to calculate. Every second that passed brought more swarm organisms into the engagement zone. I could hear them, the clicking, the scraping of chitin against concrete and metal, the wet, organic sound of thousands of bodies pressing closer, filling every corridor and avenue of approach with dark, razor-edged mass. My remaining unit members fought with the discipline and ferocity that had made us the Coalition's finest. Yusha had found a position with sightlines and was dropping organisms with her characteristic precision. The remaining Kreth were holding a choke point with blade work that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. But I could see the strain. I could see the edges of panic in the way my warriors moved, the slight hesitations, the fractional delays between target transitions that told me the unrelenting pressure was eroding their composure. Then Corrado's shuttle opened and the humans came out. I had seen them train. I had watched them fight simulated enemies in controlled environments. I had studied their techniques and marveled at their resilience and written reports about their capabilities. None of it prepared me for seeing them fight for real. Corrado was the first one on the ground. She took in the tactical situation in a single sweep of her eyes, turned to her unit, and issued a series of commands so rapid and precise that my translator struggled to keep up. Her unit responded like a single organism. They split into fire teams, each one moving to cover a specific sector of the perimeter. They filled gaps in our defensive line that I had not even identified yet, positioning themselves at exactly the points where the swarm pressure was greatest. They did it in under 90 seconds. The sound of human weapons was different from ours, sharper, more rhythmic. They fired in controlled bursts, each burst precisely aimed, each pause exactly long enough to reacquire the next target. There was no wasted ammunition, no panic fire, no spray and pray desperation. Every round went where it was supposed to go, and swarm organisms dropped with a regularity that felt mechanical. I watched their fire discipline and compared it to what I knew from other Coalition species. The Draelith favored volume of fire, overwhelming targets, with sustained output from high-capacity weapons. The Fenari used single precision shots. The Gorvan relied on heavy weapons that traded accuracy for destructive force. The humans did something none of us did. They adapted their fire pattern to the target. Short bursts for strikers, longer engagements for brood forms, single-aimed shots for the joints and sensory organs of the larger organisms. They read the battlefield in real time and adjusted their approach to each threat individually, as if every engagement was a unique problem requiring a unique solution. Their communication was constant, but never cluttered. Short phrases, grid coordinates, Target descriptions that were stripped to bare essentials. No emotion, no fear, no encouragement, just information, passed efficiently between operators who trusted each other completely and needed nothing beyond the tactical data to do their jobs. A surge of strikers hit the eastern perimeter, where 3 humans held a makeshift barricade of collapsed debris. The strikers came in a wave, 30 or more, climbing over each other in their eagerness to reach the warm bodies behind the barrier. One of the humans, a lean male with red hair, whose name I later learned was Nathan Price, took a barbed limb through his left shoulder. The limb went in clean and came out bloody, and Price did not scream. He looked at the wound, snapped the barbed tip off the limb that was still embedded in his flesh, applied a one-handed tourniquet from a kit on his belt, transitioned his weapon to his right hand, and resumed firing. The entire sequence took 8 seconds. He did not miss a beat. He did not miss a shot. His left arm hung useless at his side, and he kept fighting with his right, as if he had always been a one-armed shooter, and his rate of fire did not decrease by a single round per minute. I remembered the training hall, the broken nose, the bleeding leg, the kill house runs where pain made them faster. It was not theater. This was what they had been practicing for. Every brutal, self-inflicted moment of that training session had been a rehearsal for this exact scenario. Get hurt. Keep fighting. Deal with the injury when the fight is over. Not before. Never before. The battle stretched. 10 minutes, 15, 20. The swarm kept coming. Waves of strikers supported by larger brood forms that hurled barbed projectiles from positions behind the main assault line. My remaining warriors fought with everything they had, and I watched them begin to flag. Not from injuries, from the sustained intensity, the constant flood of adrenaline, the relentless pace of target acquisition, firing, repositioning, and firing again. Dralith combat doctrine was built around decisive engagement. Hit hard, hit fast, end it quickly. We were not built for attrition warfare. Our bodies peaked early, and our performance degraded steadily after the first burst of combat intensity. The humans did not degrade. If anything, they sharpened. 20 minutes into the fight, their communication became shorter, their movements more efficient, their fire more accurate. The chaos that had initially disoriented us seemed to focus them. They narrowed, compressed, became denser versions of themselves, packing more lethality into less motion. I watched Corrado move along the perimeter, checking positions, redistributing ammunition, adjusting fire sectors, and she moved with the calm authority of someone managing a difficult but manageable situation, rather than someone fighting for her life. I thought about the sleep deprivation, the environmental conditioning, the 42 hours awake before they even arrived at the compound. They had rehearsed this exact situation, not the specifics of the swarm, or the colony world, or the failed intelligence. The condition, the state of being exhausted, under fire, outgunned, and running low on everything except the willingness to continue. They had practiced existing in that state until it became familiar, until it became normal, until the panic that would have overwhelmed any other species simply found no purchase in their minds because they had already been there, already felt it, already learned to function through it. One of the humans, a quiet male named Graham Cole, who I had barely noticed during the training observation, took up a position on a collapsed roof section that gave him elevated sight lines across the southern approach. He began picking off swarm organisms with single shots at ranges that made Yisha turn her head from across the perimeter. Each shot was patient, measured. He was timing his breathing the way I had seen Yisha do it, but where Yisha had been trained in that technique from birth, this human had learned it as a skill, practiced it until it was instinct, and was now applying it under fire while bleeding from a cut above his eye that he had not bothered to wipe away because it was not affecting his sight picture. 25 minutes in, we lost Threll. The swarm pushed a massive alpha form through the southern wall. It was the largest organism I had ever seen, a towering construct of chitin and muscle and razor appendages that stood 4 meters tall and moved with a speed that its size should have made impossible. It came through the wall like a battering ram, and it headed straight for the center of our perimeter, where the wounded were being treated. Threll intercepted it. My Gorvon second in command, the strongest warrior I had ever known, the male who had told me he did not want to fight the humans because pain made them faster, stepped into the path of the alpha form and met it head-on. His bone-plated fists struck its carapace with blows that would have cracked starship hull plating. He staggered it, drove it back a step. For one perfect moment, it looked like he might take it down through sheer force. Then the alpha form brought its primary limb around in an arc so fast I could not track it, and it struck Threll across the chest with enough force to send him through a concrete partition. He hit the ground behind the rubble and did not get up. My scanner showed his vitals dropping, and then flatline, and I heard myself make a sound that was not a word. The alpha form turned toward the wounded and began to advance. Corrado hit it from the left side. She was not alone. 4 humans were with her. Nathan Price with his one functional arm among them. They did not shoot the alpha form. Their weapons were not powerful enough to penetrate its primary carapace at any useful depth. Instead, they did something that no tactical manual from any species in the coalition would have recommended. They closed the distance. They ran at it, 5 humans running directly toward a 4-meter apex predator that had just killed the strongest warrior in the coalition with a single blow. They ran at it, and they climbed it. Like it was terrain, like it was an obstacle course, like it was a wall in a kill house that needed to be breached. Not one of them hesitated. Not one of them looked at the body of the Gorvon warrior, who had outweighed all 5 of them combined, and considered that they might meet the same fate. They saw a target. They assessed its vulnerabilities. They executed a plan that would have been suicidal for any species that fought through strength alone. But the humans were not fighting through strength. They were fighting through audacity, through coordination, and through the absolute refusal to accept that a 4-meter organism was something they could not bring down. Price grabbed a ridge on its lower carapace and hauled himself up with one arm, his feet finding purchase on the biological armor plates. A female soldier named Lena Marsh went up the other side, driving a combat knife into the gaps between plates and using the handle as a handhold. 2 more humans attacked its legs, not to damage them, but to distract the organism, to keep its attention divided, to prevent it from focusing on the figures climbing its body. Corrado went straight up the front. The alpha form's secondary limbs slashed at her, and she dodged one, took a shallow cut from another that opened a line of red across her ribs, and kept climbing. She reached the junction between its head and its thorax, the point where the primary neural cluster was located behind a thin section of cranial plate. She pulled a thermite charge from her vest, armed it, and drove it into the gap with both hands. The detonation was white-hot and localized. The alpha form's neural cluster vaporized. The organism convulsed, its limbs spasming, its body tilting. Corrado jumped clear as it toppled. She hit the ground, rolled, and came up on her feet bleeding from at least a dozen wounds. Her face was covered in dark alien fluid. Her uniform was shredded. She looked like something that had crawled out of a battlefield from the deepest level of a war simulation. She turned to her unit and called for a perimeter reset. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not tremble. She was wounded and bleeding and had just killed an organism 50 times her size by climbing it with her bare hands and detonating a charge at point-blank range, and her first action after hitting the ground was to resume command. Extraction arrived 8 minutes later. The coalition assault carriers dropped through the smoke and laid down suppressive fire that pushed the swarm back long enough for us to load the wounded and the dead. The carrier gunners pounded the approach corridors with heavy weapons that turned the advancing swarm organisms into fragments, buying us precious seconds that the humans used with ruthless efficiency. They had an evacuation protocol that they executed without discussion, without confusion, without wasted movement. Wounded first, sorted by severity. Equipment second, prioritized by tactical value. Dead last, because the dead could wait, but the living could not. Dorvon was alive but critical. Caldris was functional but traumatized. Threll was dead. 3 other members of Strike Unit Apex had sustained injuries severe enough to end their combat careers. We had lost 3 of 12. The humans had lost 2 of 20. Derek Hall and Sophie Grant, killed in the first swarm surge when a brood form detonated a projectile cluster at their position. 11 of the remaining 18 were wounded, some of them seriously. Nathan Price had a barbed limb still embedded in his shoulder and refused to let the medics remove it until he had personally confirmed that every allied wounded was loaded onto the carriers first. He stood at the loading ramp for 17 minutes with alien chitin sticking out of his body, directing evacuation traffic with his one good arm. and when the last stretcher was aboard, he walked up the ramp under his own power, sat down on the deck, and said he could use a bandage if anyone had a minute. I sat beside Corrado in the medical bay of the carrier. She was getting 7 separate wounds closed by the medical team, and she had refused anesthesia because there was a limited supply, and she had given her allocation to Yusha, who had taken a projectile fragment to the leg during the final push. Corrado sat still while the medics worked on her, and the only sign of pain was a slight tightening around her eyes each time the sealing tool activated. I asked her how she was still conscious. She looked at me with eyes that were bloodshot and circled with exhaustion and steady as stone. She said consciousness was a choice. She said she would sleep when everyone was home. I looked around the medical bay at her unit, battered, bleeding, bandaged with field dressings that were already soaking through. 11 wounded out of 18 survivors, and not one of them had shut down. They were checking each other's injuries. They were cleaning their weapons. One of them was writing in a small notebook, and I realized with a start that he was recording lessons learned from the engagement while the medics worked on a gash across his forearm. Another was eating a ration bar with one hand, while a medic stitched a laceration on the other. A third, a young female soldier with a bandaged leg, was methodically reloading magazines and stacking them beside her bunk in neat rows. Nathan Price was asleep. Not unconscious. Asleep. The medics had finally removed the barbed limb from his shoulder, sealed the wound, and pumped him full of whatever limited painkillers remained. He had been conscious for the entire extraction, had walked onto the carrier under his own power, had supervised the stowing of equipment, and had stayed awake long enough to confirm that every member of his fire team was accounted for. Then he had closed his eyes and dropped into sleep with the instantaneous completeness of someone who had trained their body to rest the moment the mission allowed it. Even his sleep was disciplined. Corrado noticed me watching Price and said he would be operational again within 72 hours. She said it with the certainty of someone stating a known physical law, and I believed her, because I had seen what her species treated as a physical law, and it bore no resemblance to what anyone else in the galaxy considered possible. They were not invincible. They were not immune to pain or fear or death. 2 of them were in body bags in the cargo hold. They bled and broke and died, just like every other species in the galaxy. But between the moment they started breaking and the moment they finally stopped, there was a gap that no other species could match. A vast, impossible space filled with nothing but the refusal to quit. They fought in that space. They lived in that space. They had trained their entire lives to operate inside that space, and when the galaxy threw its worst at them, they did not flinch. They leaned in. I thought about Threll, about the strongest warrior I had ever known, brought down by a single blow from a creature that outmassed him 10-1. And I thought about Danielle Corrado, who weighed less than one of Threll's arms, climbing that same creature with her bare hands, and killing it with a charge she detonated inches from her own face. Threll was the galaxy's answer to the question of how to build a perfect warrior. Corrado was the human answer. And the human answer was not about perfection. It was about persistence. About being the thing that kept coming. The thing that took the hit and got up. The thing that lost the advantage and found another one. The thing that refused, at the deepest cellular level, to accept that the fight was over. I began writing my after-action report that night. The tactical section was straightforward. Engagement metrics, casualty figures, ammunition expenditure, equipment status. The standard framework that reduced combat to numbers and let command make decisions based on data. But there was a section at the end of the report that required a subjective assessment, a narrative evaluation of Allied unit performance. I had written hundreds of these over my career, for dozens of species across dozens of engagements. I always found the right words. I always knew how to capture what I had seen in language that command could process. This time, I stared at the section header for over an hour. Assessment of human combat capability. The cursor blinked on the empty page. I thought about everything I had seen: the training hall, the environmental conditioning, the kill house, the stress inoculation, the conversation with Corrado, the battle on Varath Minor, Threll's death and Price's shoulder, and Corrado climbing the alpha form, and the human with the broken nose who got faster when he hurt, and the 42 hours without sleep, and the card game in the barracks, and the laughter on the sparring mat, and the quiet, steady certainty in Corrado's eyes when she told me that consciousness was a choice. I typed one sentence. I read it back. I decided it was the most accurate tactical assessment I had ever written. Do not fight them, under any circumstances, ever. I submitted the report and closed my eyes. Around me, the carrier hummed through space toward the nearest coalition base. In the medical bay below, 18 humans were resting, healing, and preparing to do it all again. Not because they had to, because that was what they were. The species that got back up. The species that treated its own limits as suggestions. The species that the galaxy's mightiest warriors watched in silence, not because we had nothing to say, but because we had finally seen something that left us without words. And in the quiet of my quarters, with the stars sliding past the viewport, and the memory of the day still burning in my mind, I understood something that would stay with me for the rest of my career. The galaxy had been measuring warriors wrong. We measured them by what they could do at their best. The humans measured themselves by what they could endure at their worst. And in the long, grinding, brutal arithmetic of war, endurance would always outlast excellence. Always.